Blair was waiting patiently when Steve arrived. He was relieved to see her, but feeling guilty. He should have texted to tell her he was running late. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said as he gave her a heartfelt hug. "I was afraid something happened," she said. Steve heard genuine concern, not scolding in her voice. "You've been so busy we haven't gotten together all week. But what's going on?" she asked. "A lot," Steve replied. "You okay?" "Physically, yes," he said cryptically. Over dinner at their favourite Mexican restaurant, Steve shared the strange events of the past week. He began with the botched ad campaign proposal for United Bank and how it led to meeting Kayla. "She taught me something," he said. He pulled out one of his business cards and asked Blair if she had a pair of scissors in her purse. She pulled out a tiny pair of cuticle scissors. "Will these do?" With a straight face, Steve asked her to cut a hole in the card large enough for him to put his head through. "That's why you're upset? A strange woman asked you to cut a hole in your business card and stick your head through it?" Steve laughed for the first time that evening. "Partly," he kidded. "Go ahead, try it." "It's a trick." Blair put the scissors down and crossed her arms, refusing to play. "You're absolutely right. Actually, it's the first trick of a self-leader." Steve told her about elephant thinking and the importance of challenging assumed constraints. He then took the scissors, cut the card into a large ring, and placed it over her head. The people at the next table, who'd been stealing glances their way, clapped in appreciation. "Okay," Blair said. "So what did you do with this revelation about assumed constraints?" Steve described the meeting with his team, where he'd realized that his assumptions about his team members, the client, and his role had made him a victim. "I'm not exactly a natural-born leader," he said with a shake of his head. Blair reached out and touched his hand. "Is that why I didn't see you last weekend? Because you're feeling down on yourself? Did your motorcycle ride help at all?" "I almost forgot about that, and it's the strangest part yet." "What happened?" Blair asked. Steve told her about his Harley dying and his bizarre roadside meeting with Kayla. He described the trip to the legendary Hal's Harley dealership, the conversation about power, and the mysterious receipt revealing the second trick of self-leadership. "So what's the trick?" she asked, sounding both curious and skeptical. Steve handed the receipt to her. "Activate your points of power," Blair said, reading from the slip of paper. "I certainly didn't use my points of power with the United Bank account project," Steve said. "I should have been the one initiating action and directing others." "But how could you lead others when you didn't even know what you were doing? You've never been an account executive before." Blair's statement surprised Steve. How could it be so clear to her when he had needed Kayla to point it out to him? "I finally realized that today. I think I'm in the midst of learning the final trick. At first I diagnosed myself at the D1, enthusiastic beginner stage on almost every aspect in my role. But because I didn't get the S1 direction leadership style I needed, I'm now at the D2 disillusioned learner stage, and I need an S2 coaching leadership style. On some things, such as budgeting and scheduling, I was at the D4 self-reliant achiever stage, and fine with an S4 delegating leadership style. But now I'm not sure I'm as competent as I thought, so I've regressed to the D3 capable but cautious performer stage, requiring an S3 supporting style of leadership." The words tumbled from Steve without pause. When he was finished, Blair was staring blankly at him. "I have no idea what you just said." Steve roared with laughter. "I must sound like I'm speaking a foreign language. Wait just a second." Steve rose from the table and disappeared around the corner. When he returned, he had 2 rubber bands that he'd managed to get from the restaurant's front desk. "I was talking about the 4 stages of learning and mastering something new," he said. "I'm going to show you a rubber band trick as an example." He began teaching Blair the magic trick, pulling out the card with the SL2 and using it for reference. After a few minutes, they decided that they were both at D2 on the rubber band trick. Blair's eyes grew bright as she saw the connection between the rubber band trick and Steve's work. "So as far as your job goes, you've diagnosed yourself at the D2 disillusioned learner stage on most of your important goals, and you've determined that you need more direction and support to succeed in your job." Blair frowned. "So where do you go from here?" Steve confided that he had until noon on Monday to figure it out. "I'm not sure if I should resign and end the pain, or fight for my job and risk having Rhonda fire me. What do you think?" "I think you're very lucky to have run into Kayla," Blair said. I'll make you a deal. If you'll help me with my 10K run tomorrow, I'll help you think through a plan for your meeting with Rhonda. Oh man, I've been so wrapped up in my own problems I forgot you had your first race tomorrow. Steve shook his head. I want to help, but I'm not sure what I can do between now and tomorrow morning. Here's my diagnosis, Blair said, referring to the model. When it comes to my training schedule, I am capable of the short runs during the week, but I've never had the confidence to finish that 10K practice run on the weekend. I think I'm at the D3 capable but cautious performer stage. For the race tomorrow, I'm at the D2 disillusioned learner stage. I've never run in a race with hundreds of people before, so my competence is low. I don't know how I'll react, and I'm afraid. Guess that means my commitment is low. What if I can't finish? Come on, Blair, Steve encouraged. You can walk 6 miles if you have to. What if I come in last? I'll be horrified. Blair put her hands over her eyes as though trying to block out the image of her straggling across the finish line long after the others have completed their race. Steve laughed. You are a disillusioned learner. How can I support you? Blair's impish smile made Steve wonder what he'd gotten himself into. I have relationship power with you, and I'm going to use it. Here's my request. Run with me. You've run in dozens of races and know what it's like. You have knowledge power. Be my running partner and coach. I need an S2 coaching leadership style, with both direction and support. Are you kidding? I haven't trained, Steve complained. As slow as I am, you don't need training to keep up. Blair and Steve kept talking on their way back from dinner. As he was driving home, Steve realized that because he'd taught the model to Blair, they now had a common framework to discuss where they were on their goals and what they needed to reach them. As the sun came up Saturday morning, Steve put on his running gear, did some quick warm-ups, and headed out the door to pick up Blair. Blair beamed when she saw Steve in his running clothes. I knew you'd go for it. She handed him a bagel and a sport drink. I have a feeling you might need these. I couldn't turn down a self-leader in need, Steve said with a smile. You asked for help, and that takes strength. They got into the car and headed out for the race. After a few minutes of silence, Blair said, I was thinking about the 2 tricks Kayla taught you, to challenge assumed constraints and activate your points of power. Those are potent concepts. I wouldn't be a runner at all if I hadn't used them. I just wasn't aware I was using them. Explain, Steve urged. Remember when I first started running? I bought cute shorts and tops, running shoes, good socks. I had all the best stuff. I was feeling very proud of myself. I took off down the street, ran the first block, and began to feel my thigh muscles tighten. I tried to control my breathing, but I couldn't get any air. I got that side stitch that wouldn't go away. Steve chuckled. I remember your excuse. You said, I must have fast twitch muscles. They're really not built for long-distance running. That was my assumed constraint. Although I used to be a pretty good sprinter, I assumed I couldn't run long distance as well. You helped me challenge that assumed constraint by explaining that running uses very different muscles than what I was used to. You told me it was going to require more effort than buying good shoes. I nailed that one, Steve said proudly. The point is, I wanted to quit. I started off at the D1 enthusiastic beginner stage, and it only took me 2 blocks to get to the D2 disillusioned learner stage. So what did you need? Steve asked. To my credit, I realized I needed coaching so I could learn to run differently. I needed someone to observe, monitor, and evaluate my running. Someone to show me how, by giving me feedback. I needed an S1 directing leadership style. But since I never got it, I was at the point where I needed an S2 coaching style of leadership. I remember now, said Steve. You went to a friend who was a high school cross-country coach, and he helped you put a training program together. You used your relationship power to find someone with knowledge power. That's right, said Blair. My coach helped me map out an entire strategy that included a running support group, getting feedback on my breathing and running technique, subscribing to a running magazine, and recruiting you to encourage me to keep up with my training schedule. You went out and hired a coach, and he helped you achieve your goal, said Steve. Which reminds me of a favourite quote, said Blair. A person who does not have a goal is used by someone who does. That's true, Steve agreed. And sometimes our goals aren't reached because we let assumed constraints defeat us. Or we don't use our points of power, added Blair. It occurred to me that a big mistake we make in our jobs is thinking that the only place to get direction and support is from our managers. but as you realized with your team the other day, that's an assumed constraint. Steve, you have a number of people and resources you can tap to get the direction and support you need to turn this United bank account around. I have a feeling you have points of power you haven't begun to activate. You're probably right. Steve slowed as he approached the turn that would take them to the starting point of the race. We need to map out a strategy for your meeting with Rhonda, just like I did with my running. I think it'll work. If it doesn't, I can always fall back on my exit strategy and quit, Steve said. Blair sighed. Threatening to quit is just your way of feeling some sense of control when you're faced with a tough goal. Maybe. Steve pulled into the parking lot where hundreds of runners were congregated. What is your goal today? He asked. What time are you trying to make? Forget time. My goal is just to complete the 10K. Fair enough. If just finishing the race is motivating to you, that's what we'll focus on doing. But I think you should set a standard, he said. Pointing to a woman who appeared to be in her 80s, he said, I think you should try to beat her. Blair didn't take the bait. That's not a smart goal. I have no control over how fast that woman runs. It would be just my luck that she holds the national title for senior women. Shouldn't you have some standard? Steve asked. How about this? My goal is not to be the last one over the finish line. That means that if I can't continue, you have to carry me over. They made their way to the registration table, picked up their numbers and pinned them on their t-shirts. All kinds of people milled around the booth that offered food, drink, products, promotions and massages. Music filled the air. The atmosphere was electric, and Steve felt energized. It was fun just being part of the event. People were gathering at the starting line. Blair and Steve were positioned midway in the pack when Blair darted forward, weaving her way to the front. She turned back and signaled Steve to follow her. She doesn't know the front of the pack is reserved for qualified runners and sponsored professionals, Steve thought. He wondered if she would notice that the numbers pinned to their shirts were in the range of 001 to 100, and hers was 2045. As she reached the front row, he realized she was too pumped up to notice much of anything. On your mark, the starter bellowed from the PA system. Steve hadn't reacted in time to stop Blair. Get set! The shot of the starting gun rang out, and they were off. The exhilaration he had at the start of the race thrilled Steve. He could feel the ground shaking from the thousands of feet pounding behind him. He heard the collective breathing of hundreds of runners. By the time he caught up with Blair, dozens of runners had passed them by. Unbelievable, Blair shouted. Why are people running so fast this early in the race? I'll never finish if I try to keep up. I'm already ready to give up. What should I do, coach? Pace yourself. Just make it to the fountain. Okay, so I make it to the fountain, then what? She asked, breathing hard. Feel the spray coming off the fountain. It's invigorating. And remember your goal. Oh yeah, finish. Blair slowed her pace and began to catch her breath. What happened there at the start of the race? Steve asked. I got so excited I decided to go for it. I thought maybe I could win my age group or something. Steve found Blair's innocence endearing. That would be something, wouldn't it? To win your age group in your first race after training for a couple of months. He tried not to sound too judgmental. Blair smiled. I get it, he said, between breaths. I acted as though I were at the self-reliant achiever stage, starting up front, thinking I could outpace or at least keep up with the best. I was in the classic enthusiastic beginner stage, so that's why I'm now at the disillusioned learner stage. It didn't take me long to get from D1 to D2, did it? She clearly didn't need an answer. Steve replied anyway. Remember the old Italian proverb, things get harder before they get easier. It struck him that he needed to heed the adage himself. His frustration with his job, he noted, was a normal part of the learning curve that needed to be acknowledged and dealt with. It wasn't a reason to quit. Soon they passed the fountain and felt the invigorating spray. I made that milestone, Blair panted. Now what? Keep going, one step at a time, Steve replied. For the rest of the race, Blair asked Steve for the direction and support she needed. She encouraged herself out loud, so Steve could add something if he thought she needed it. Just make it around the corner, good girl. Now just make it up to those two people. They don't seem that fast. Way to go, Blair. Every once in a while she asked Steve for specific directions. Am I using my arms efficiently for uphill climbs? Do I need to do something different as we go downhill? If I'm breathing too hard to talk, does that mean I'm pacing myself too fast? And should I slow down? Sometimes Steve gave her direct answers, sometimes he asked her to experience it and report back what she thought was best. An hour into the race, Steve was jogging easily. Such was not the case for Blair. She was huffing and puffing, almost wheezing. At last they caught sight of the finish line. "Okay, coach," Blair managed to pant. "Other runners have said this is where they get that rush of adrenaline, their second wind, and sprint for the finish. I don't have any hope. I'm not sure I ever found my first wind. My legs are like lead, my lungs ache. I hope I can finish." Steve was beginning to worry. He didn't want to carry her across. Then they heard familiar voices cheering from the sidelines. They glanced over and saw a group of friends yelling and screaming like crazy. "Oh, wow," Blair said. "I didn't know they'd all be here." She smiled despite the pain. "I'm sure they're in shock seeing that I'm still upright." "And that you're not last," Steve added. With that, Blair's entire face and body changed. She caught her second wind. "Let's go," she shouted, waving to their friends as she took off. Steve was just ready to kick it up a notch when he thought he noticed another familiar face in the crowd. Was that Kayla cheering them on? No, it couldn't be. He looked again and the face was gone. Blair beat him to the finish line. When he arrived, she hugged him jubilantly. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she bubbled. He hugged back, but kept her walking, fearing her legs might cramp. "Look," Blair said, pointing toward the finish line. "People are still finishing." People were still coming in, but even more runners had finished before them. It had taken them just over an hour to run 6.2 miles. That was not a fast time. At that time, Steve had an epiphany. He knew Blair was a very competitive person, yet curiously, knowing that hundreds of people had finished before she didn't bother her. In fact, she was overjoyed to finish the race, to have achieved her goal. It didn't matter what the others had done. The race helped Steve realize there is joy in diagnosing your development level and getting the direction and support you need to achieve your goal. Without getting what she needed, Blair would have quit after the first 2 blocks, just as he was about to quit after a couple of months of being an account executive. Soon they were surrounded by their friends. They spent the next hour collecting their new T-shirts and enjoying the booths, exhibits and goodies that came with finishing the race. As they walked to their cars, Blair hugged each of their friends. "Thank you for giving me the support I needed when I needed it," she said. Later, as they sat in the traffic line, inching toward the parking lot attendant, Steve asked Blair to sort through the bag of coupons and free samples and find their parking ticket. "Are you sure you put it in there?" she asked. "I can't find it." They were at the parking lot pay booth. Steve hated holding up traffic. He rolled down the window to explain they were still searching for the ticket. "Don't worry, it's taken care of," the attendant said. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. "That woman paid for you." The attendant pointed up ahead, where a small woman on a Harley-Davidson roared out the exit. "She said something about how special you are," the attendant said as he handed Steve a receipt. Steve thanked the attendant, handed Blair the receipt, and pulled onto the highway. "That was Kayla up ahead," he said, in an amazed tone of voice. "I thought I spotted her in the crowd, but I figured I was seeing things." "Did you tell her we'd be here?" Blair asked. "I don't remember," Steve said. "Well, this is no ordinary parking receipt," Blair said as she held it up for Steve to look at. The receipt was emblazoned with the message, "The third trick of self-leadership. Be proactive. Get what you need to succeed."